and welcome to Face to Face as a special United Nations debate on education, human rights and conflict. I'm Imogen Foulkes here at UN headquarters in Geneva. Welcome to our audience. Welcome also to our viewers around the world. In a moment, we're going to hear from our panel of experts about the impact of conflict on the education of children around the world. Now, to talk about the complexities of conflict and education, we're privileged today to have a really distinguished panel. In the middle there, Asma Jahangir. Many of you may know her already. She's a lawyer by profession, an advocate of the Supreme Court in Pakistan. Now, next to her, we have Tove Wang, Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children. She's also chair of Save the Children's first global campaign known as Rewrite the Future. I'd also like to welcome Professor Mamadou Diouf. He is Leitner Family Professor of African Studies and Director of the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University. And finally, we also have Ambassador Lazarus Kapambwe. He'll be joining us as well for today's discussion. But before we start, we have a small film we'd like to show you about the way conflict does impact children around the world.
"67 million children around the world are not in primary school. Around 53% are girls. Violent conflict has a direct impact on whether girls and boys go to school. Almost 30 million children in conflict-ridden countries do not attend school. During Burundi's civil war, hundreds of thousands of children witnessed atrocities that scarred them for life.
I saw combatants cutting throats. I was horrified, jumping over dead bodies.
Donation was forcefully recruited as a child soldier while still a boy. This violated his human rights to a basic education. During the conflict, the school system was crippled. But years later, it's up and running, and young Burundians are back in school, catching up with their lessons and thinking of their future. In Cambodia, during the Khmer Rouge regime, teachers and students risked their lives if caught reading books or performing traditional dances.
During the Khmer Rouge, everyone, not only me, we cannot tell them I was teacher, no. I'm the worker. Because the 75 to 80% of our teacher was killed during the Khmer Rouge regime.
Schools were turned into prisons and torture centers. More than 3 decades later, the situation is improving. Volunteers are being trained, and some parents are coming forward to serve as teachers. But most children are fortunate to learn and lead normal lives. Here, in Egypt, Yusriya is getting a chance to go to school. Her older sister was deprived of an education. Now, Yusriya teaches her sister.
Education is great. After 10 years, I will have finished school. I will have finished college, and God willing, I will be a doctor, God willing.
Attending primary school has motivated Yusriya to dream about her future. All children must be able to complete primary school. It's a basic human right, critical in nurturing a culture of peace, developing their skills, and enriching their lives.
There was one phrase in that film that said, the situation is improving. I'd like to ask you all whether you genuinely think the situation is improving. Tove Wang, I'd like to ask you first.
Of course, the situation is improving because more and more children are getting into school. But the great concern is, as we have heard here, the 28 million children living in conflict area not going to school. When I have traveled around the last 5 years in 20 conflict countries to work on education, what really has impressed me and made an impression on my mind is the resolve that children and parents are showing to maintain and provide education during the conflict. I met this one father in Afghanistan who was standing in front of his village school, and he said to me, if they come to close this school, they will have to take me down first. And it wasn't his son who went to school, which we often think, it was his daughter who went to that school. We cannot afford to wait for a peaceful situation to provide education. We have to dare the risk of providing education during conflict.
Asma, Jahangir, how do you think we do that? Provide education for all children in a country, for example, like Afghanistan, where you have not just a conflict, but one section of society which isn't interested in girls going to school at all?
We have to be able to challenge that mentality, and therefore the work or the challenge before the international community is not simply to make buildings, but also to be able to ensure that what goes into these buildings is not indoctrination, but it does prepare a child for a pluralistic society, and then to be able to contest those individuals or groups that believe that certain sections of society, like girl child, should not be allowed to go to school.
Ambassador Kabambwe, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, donor countries, for example, are they sensitive enough when they come into countries in conflict and say, this is a universal human right and this is how it should be applied?
This morning, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was talking about broken promises, broken trust, and broken dreams. I think that when it comes to education, we still are of the mindset that there is them and there is us. I don't think that we see the education of children as a collective responsibility for all of us. This is a problem in the least developed countries. It is not, what happens there doesn't seem to affect what happens in these other places. And yet, the practice is the contrary. The least developed countries are investing about 16 to 20 years in educating their children to a level of first degree. And these children end up migrating to the north, where the north invests 1 or 2 years in giving them postgraduate studies, and yet these kids stay in the north and deprive the environments that spend so much on them from the benefit of that education. I also feel that we are not addressing sufficiently the issue of vulnerable groups. And in this particular case, I would like to cite refugees and IDPs. Because mentally we are in this mindset where we see the displacement as a very temporary problem. And yet the experience on the ground is that conflict situations take such a long time that when we do not focus on the education of those kids that are displaced, we are actually losing a generation. And I find it very difficult to accept when I know that the world has sufficient resources to resolve these problems.
I am going to begin with you, Tove, Wang, and then we'll move on. The funding for education in conflict, how does that reflect our apparent commitment to making sure that education continues during a conflict?
When it comes to funding education in conflict situation, we know, we have heard several times today, that 28 million children live in conflict-affected areas. This constitutes 42% of the children out of school. But guess what? Only 21% of the funding actually goes towards these 42% of children. So there is a hesitation to invest in conflict situations. It's more risky, it's more costly I would claim that it might be too costly not to invest in education in conflict areas.
Ambassador Kabambwe, how do you think member states, the wealthy ones, can be persuaded that education is a good investment?
I would like, during the discussions at this session, for us to explore the idea that in the developed countries, they should start creating incentives for their private sector to go and invest in least developed countries. If, for instance, we could have tax breaks for those companies that invest in education and which are located in the developed countries, I think more and more companies, more and more private sector would be involved in education.
Asma, Jahangir and Professor Diouf, is it your experience, or would you argue forcefully that not investing in education can, in the long term, even the short term, fuel conflict?
I still argue investing in the wrong kind of education can also fuel conflict.
What's the wrong kind of education?
Well, for example, you have now reports about people and children being put in school where they have been taught to hate other communities, to kill even other communities, to isolate themselves, and this has ultimately led to a large number of violent acts and conflict in Pakistan, for example, as well as in Afghanistan. So therefore I insist that it's not just any kind of education. The education has to be one that prepares a child to live as a citizen of the world. And that has to be the thrust of that education.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to the audience. You have been very patient. It is going to be your turn now.
Hi, I'm Caroline Pontefract. I'm the Director of Education in UNRWA. UNRWA is a UN agency set up in 1948 to provide humanitarian and development services to the Palestinian refugees in Syria, Jordan, West Bank, Gaza and Lebanon. Given that the protracted conflict area, which is very different from some of the situations we've been talking about, what would you suggest are the kind of principles, policies, practices and priorities for an education system in this challenging, evolving context, in the context of a 60-year-old conflict?
I'm sure you are aware that the education that you are providing is creating some normalcy for children while they go to school. And actually that's one of the main reasons for why it's so important to maintain education during conflict as well. But I'm sorry, I don't really have a good answer to how to reform education in a conflict that has lasted for 60 years.
I think that education is not only simply in classrooms. So unfortunately, many of the children who live in armed conflict situations are being educated adversely or for the better for them outside of classrooms as well. So when they're in the formal education system, I would say that it is important to share their worries, because children sort of clamp up in conflict situations. They don't talk. And classroom is a place where they can communicate with teachers and peers of their own age.
I think one of the issues which are fueling conflict is the way in which, as adults, we pass our own memories to our children. And this is something we have to break up.
We've got an interesting question which has been sent to us online from Francis Nkulu from Cameroon, who says, how can educational programs be developed to overcome inequalities, which are often one of the main sources of conflict?
When you have certain communities living in a certain compound itself, particularly of minorities, whether they're ethnic or religious minorities, there the schooling system somehow is the worst kind that has been put up either by private sector or by the government. And then they only meet people of their own community, and therefore they do not have access in the real sense to other avenues of statecraft. So I think that inequality is just not in terms of language, but in terms of ensuring that all schools do not only cater to people living around them is the answer, because everybody who's rich will have a better schooling system and those that are poor will have a poor schooling system. I believe that teachers who are teaching in schools which are in areas where people are less fortunate should be paid better and given more incentive.
Ambassador Kapambwe, do you agree with that last point in particular?
We said education is a human right, and therefore it's not something that we should just leave to children. We need to educate everybody, because it is in conditions of ignorance and illiteracy that you have the most negative things being put out, the most negative views, the most intolerant views.
Another question from the floor.
Thank you very much. I am the permanent representative of Mexico to the United Nations in New York. As chairperson of the Working Group on Children in Armed Conflict in Nepal, there was a process of demobilization of some 5,000 children. I think that the factor of reintegration of these children into the education system, children who are actually involved in armed conflict, is a key element, and I think that this is one issue that needs to be fully appreciated in the context of these discussions.
Yes, Tove, could you comment on that? You know, when we get the peace, how can we use education to build on that?
We know that peace agreements and peace processes raises high expectations in people, and rightly so. And I think education is one element that could help meet these expectations. So I think thinking about education also post-war and in peace negotiations is extremely important. But just one more point, and that is, I think the whole issue of equal access is also prevents conflict.
I absolutely agree that post-conflict situation is extremely important. Otherwise, we fall back into conflict, and that vicious cycle continues to carry on. My own observation in my own country, and through other colleagues who have worked in this area, is that reintegration really, when they started, the reintegration mostly of the boy child, so to speak, or adolescent boy, is carried out by men. And it is very important that women are, a part of that reintegration scheme, because they at the point of post-conflict, they do need that to see women and to see their perspective and to have that particular special touch that women can give towards peace and towards ending of conflict.
We have a question from Max Gilbert, who's from the United States. He says attacks on education occur around the world, inside and outside of situations of armed conflict. Armed groups intentionally target schools, teachers and students. What can we do about that?
What is being attempted is to divorce the society from intellectual input, or from professional input, or from even cultural debates and cultural development. So I think that the governments have to be very vigilant about it. In my own country, many of the girls' schools have been bombarded time and again, but they are the last to be rebuilt. So if the government started to build them first, rather than a secretariat, that would be a message.
When you really have community involvement, and the community owns the education system and maybe have built the schools themselves, the school is actually less likely to be attacked.
More points from the floor. We have time for a couple more. Greece.
I have been intrigued by the argument that the private sector should invest in LDCs. And I also heard the same argument put forward that after 12 years of state education, the graduates go to another country, get a graduate degree, and then get hired in those countries. What kind of curricula have to be designed to make those graduates attractive to their own countries or to or elsewhere?
One more point from the floor, and then I'll have the panelists respond to. Kenya?
The amount of psycho-emotional lability that occurs in children in conflict and post-conflict situation is immense. What is your view and role of guidance and peace education in the interactive process in order to prepare these children for enabling learning? Thank you.
Ambassador Kapamboy, the issue of the brain drain, which the delegate from Greece brought up.
Immigration or migration is a human right as well. And any approaches that simply emphasize preventing of people moving will not be successful. Once it is acknowledged in the developed countries that the developing countries are actually training those that work in the developed countries, then assistance to education as a component of ODA could go higher, number one. Number two, in addition to the fact that the companies in the developed countries benefit from the training of these individuals in the developing world, that incentive can also be given additional incentives by, like I said, creating tax breaks.
The second question I'd like to ask you, Tove Wang, psychological or psychosocial support for children who've been in conflict.
It's an immense impact on children. And that is why it's so important to start with education very early after a disaster or early also in a conflict situation and not wait for things to settle. I think we have to look at teacher training again.
I would like to add something about the brain drain, because I'm part of a brain drain, let's say. So, and I think it's much more complicated than usually we present it, because it's much more about Africans being part of a larger world and participating in the global world in which people are moving. And each country, from India to China, Malaysia, have been trying to address the same issue. Which type of responses they are devising, facing a phenomenon which is global, is very important. Today, the issue is to basically know what are African governments thinking about that and which type of answers they are coming up with. And one of the responses is a simple response. It's creating regional universities with resources.
Okay. Last comment for you.
I think that children after post-conflict, they need sports, they need dialogue, which is very important, because often it's the elderly or the elder people who sit down and have dialogue. But you don't have children having dialogue with each other and then speaking up so that they can speak their experiences out. And I think they also need a change of environment. We need to introduce them to music, song, dance, cultural events, which is very important.
Okay, well, we're just about reached almost the end of our debate. I'm going to ask each of our panellists to sum up, reflecting on some of the points that have been raised this afternoon. And as you do it, try and incorporate perhaps a little reply to our very last online question, which is from Isabel Lapan in Australia, who says very bluntly, do countries really take children's rights seriously?
I would like to believe that we do take the rights of people very seriously, including those of children. For many of us in the developing countries, there is always this paucity of resources to spend on all the needs that we have. And we find that in the prioritization, only emergency issues tend to receive attention.
Children's rights should be taken more seriously than they are today. There is a lot of room for improvement in many sectors, including education. Save the Children has, over the last 5 years, reached out to 10 million children in conflict situations in 20 countries. And we are determined to create 3 million new places in school to bring new children into school.
Governments in many parts of the world, I'm not saying all governments, have somehow left the rights of the child for the NGOs and the INGOs to deliver. And I think it's about time that they understood that this is not primarily their responsibility, but responsibility of governments.
The right of children, in particular in Africa, with references to, and this needs to be said, to what we call our traditional values. The idea of listening to a child is very problematic. This is also one of the revolutions we need to promote in Africa, and education should have an important part in that. It's why, for me, one of the most important lessons is to make sure that we establish a continuum in education from the family to the nation, to make sure that values are disseminated and these values are the same values.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm afraid that is all we have time for. Thank you to our panellists, who I think gave us a really well-informed and provocative debate. We hope to see you next year for our next debate. Until then, from me, Imogen Foulkes, and from everybody here at the UN in Geneva, thanks for joining us.